And going back to our story on India's independent foreign policy, we are joined by Professor Vardhan Pant, who is the Vice President of the Observer Research Foundation and a well-known analyst on international affairs. Thank you very much, Professor Pant. So what positive impact has India's strategic autonomy had on world affairs in these turbulent times?
Thanks, Mark. Mark, I think in some ways India has been, almost a beacon of hope at a time when the multilateralism, the multilateral order that was created post 1945 has been in crisis, and there has been a leadership vacuum amongst major powers, all either looking inwards or very aggressive, challenging the system, challenging the status quo. And I think in that sense, India, by keeping its channels of communication open to every stakeholder, by being very open about resolving global challenges through negotiations and dialogue, and by bringing a whole host of actors together to think about the challenges of the global order as well as the solutions that need to be provided at this very critical juncture, has been able to situate itself at a very important juncture in global politics, articulating the desire that I think many countries feel that there is a need for independence, that there is a need for strategic autonomy in global affairs that allows for a more wholesome conversation to happen. Because when you get divided into all kinds of polarities, when you get divided into all these groupings which are ostensibly working at cross purposes, then I think having that ability to navigate those cross currents, having that ability to navigate those divergences, that's something that a country like India has been able to deliver, has been able to achieve throughout the last few years, and particularly yes, I think the last year when we saw India's successful shepherding of G20. Right. That I think has made given lots of countries great confidence in also their ability to navigate these challenging times.
Professor Pant, do you see reformed multilateralism being fast-tracked? Because India continues to put pressure. We've heard the External Affairs Minister saying so. But now that India is the fastest growing large economy, it's being recognized that way. It's also the largest country by population. So, I mean, the pressure that India puts might have something to bear.
I think certainly if ever there was a time when significant actors on the global stage were looking at this question seriously and actually have been wondering about the consequences of their inaction, this is that time, and I think India has been able to put its point of view across very credibly, very effectively, and also make a broader point that, look, this is not about India per se. This is about the kind of the world that we want to live in. That India, of course, India is, as you point out, largest, fastest growing major economy, one of the largest democracy in the world, one of the, a country that is willing and able now increasingly to provide solutions to global problems, and also one of the, the most populous country in the world today. Of course, India will be part of any attempt to find global solutions, but if the multilateral order is not responding to the needs of India, then it will be the multilateral order that will be the sufferer. India yes, will survive, India will continue, India will be part of the global stakeholder engagement. Yes. But the multilateral order will I think, become less credible. And I think that's the point that India has been making pretty effectively.
Professor Pant, President Putin has praised India's independent foreign policy. And of course, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had told President Putin that this is not the era of war. We can recall that. How much of an influence can India have on ending this war in Ukraine?
I think India can have a significant impact in the sense that India has been able to, for example, we have seen the mobilization of a large part of the developing world and their agenda, and that agenda is in particular a way about economic dynamism, economic growth. Because because of the Ukraine crisis, because of the Ukraine war, a lot of the countries in the developing South have been facing economic problems, fuel challenges, energy challenges, and I think India made that point very, very categorically. And India, unlike say a country like China, which has not actually suggested as much publicly, India went public with this, and which you noted Prime Minister saying publicly to President Putin that, look, this is not the time for war for nations to think about. They have to think about bigger issues and global solutions to major challenges facing the world. So in that sense, I think India's ability to bring its influence, bring its its relationships to bear on a crisis like Ukraine at this point is pretty effective, and I think we have seen some of that also getting reflected in Mr. Modi's meetings with a country like France and with Mr. Macron. I think both are on the same page that this has to come to some kind of a settlement. How that settlement emerges remains to be seen.
Also, Professor Pant, India is part of the I2U2. That includes Israel, US, and the UAE. So, how do you view this grouping in bringing about some sort of a viable solution to the Israel-Hamas conflict?
I think I2U2, of course, was designed as largely an economic grouping, focusing on economic and energy and related matters in the region. But I think this is the time now for it to step up because there are four very significant stakeholders there, and I think India, UAE, and the US certainly can come together and also let Israel know that that continuing conflict in the Middle East is having global implications, and we are seeing what is happening in the Red Sea and how that is challenging the economic viability of our global economic order. So in that sense, I think that argument can be made and is being made in some ways to Israel. I think the question is whether the two antagonists in the Middle Eastern crisis do see this as a point where they can reflect on it seriously and move ahead, because both sides are not at this point willing to give. But certainly, I think India's role in the region, India's ability to shape that region has been pretty evident, not only with I2U2, but also with IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor that was announced at the G20. So I think even the viability of that corridor now is contingent on what happens to the Israel-Hamas war and how that pans out.
Indeed. Professor Pant, also India has a vision to be a developed country by 2047, and it's a vision now that's shared on the foreign policy front as well. What do you see as the foreign policy imperatives to achieve this?
I think for a country like India, and which has stated now quite unequivocally that it wants to focus on being a developed country by 2047, the primary focus, the primary goal is, and the primary outlook has to be oriented towards its own domestic developmental agenda. But in order for that developmental agenda to be fulfilled, India, like most countries in the world, need a stable global order. We cannot have a global order where there are multiple crises brewing around, where now multiple wars are being fought in different geographies of the world, and where the global economic order rests on very shaky foundations as it is today. So I think India's priority on the foreign policy front has to be, and is increasingly, how to shape a regional and global order that is stable, that can allow for the prosperity of India to be carried forward, and that can allow the aspirations of the multitude of Indians to be achieved. And I think for that, India is therefore working on its relationships and partnerships that allows it to that possibility to come to fruition. And as I think we started this conversation talking about strategic autonomy, and I think that's where it most fundamentally is needed, because India cannot afford a global economy that is coming under pressure because of great power politics, because of geopolitical tensions, and therefore keeping its channels of communication open, keeping its partnerships viable, and making those partnerships work towards common goal and common agenda is something that is required, and something that India has been working towards, because that is not only a foreign policy prerogative, but that is increasingly a domestic political and domestic economic imperative.
Professor Harsh Vardhan Pant, Vice President of the Observer Research Foundation, thank you very much for your insights.